He stood next to him before the world decided what the story would be. Not in the spotlight, not at the center of the noise, but close enough to feel the heat when it eventually arrived. Loyalty didn't look heroic back then. It didn't feel heavy. It looked ordinary, almost forgettable. Two men sharing space before everything hardened into sides, before words like icon, traitor, hero, and villain entered the room. Entity, athlete, Joe Frazier, professional boxer. Wasn't thinking about history or legacy. He was thinking about respect, about what it meant to stand by someone when there was nothing to gain yet, when loyalty was still invisible. In those early moments, nothing felt political. Nothing felt moral in the grand sense. It felt human. He had his own battles, his own pride, his own reputation to protect. Standing beside another man didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like decency. The world hadn't started watching closely yet. There were no microphones waiting for him to choose sides, no crowds demanding clarity, no headlines ready to reduce complexity into a single sentence. Just private rooms, shared understanding, and the quiet assumption that respect didn't need an audience to be real. That assumption wouldn't survive, but at the start, it was intact. Frazier believed loyalty was neutral, that it didn't change how the world treated you, that it didn't come with a price tag attached. He believed you could stand by someone without becoming part of their fight. He was wrong about that, but not yet. At first, loyalty felt light. It didn't interfere with his work. It didn't threaten his future. It didn't demand explanation. He wasn't choosing against anyone. He was simply not stepping away. And sometimes that's all it takes. The space beside someone is never empty for long. Eventually, the world fills it with meaning, whether you consent or not. But at the beginning, it was just space. A place where he stood because it felt right, not because it was rewarded. He didn't know that standing still would later be interpreted as taking a side. He didn't know that silence would be rewritten as opposition. He didn't know that loyalty, once named, could no longer remain neutral. That realization only comes later, when stories harden and people need simpler versions of events to make sense of their anger. For now, there was only proximity, only presence, only the quiet belief that you didn't abandon people before you had a reason. That belief would be tested. It would be distorted. It would be used against him. It would cost him more than he imagined. But in this moment, before the noise, before the rewriting, loyalty still felt clean. Something that didn't need defending, something that didn't require explanation. And that's how it always begins, not with a declaration, not with a speech, but with a decision so small it barely feels like one. A decision to stay where you are, to not step away when stepping away would have been easier. And once that decision is made, everything that follows starts to arrange itself around it, whether you are ready for it or not. What feels like stillness in the beginning often becomes gravity later, pulling consequences toward you long after the moment itself has passed, long after you've stopped thinking about it, long after the world decides what it wants that moment to mean, and long after you realize that staying was the first real choice you made, even if you didn't yet understand it fully at the time, completely. If you've ever stood beside someone before the cost became clear, stay with this story. At first, nothing changed on the surface. That was what made it easy to miss. The rooms were still open to him. The conversations still felt familiar. Respect still arrived without him asking for it. Loyalty at this stage didn't demand explanation. It lived quietly in the background, assumed rather than questioned. Entity, athlete, Joe Frazier, professional boxer. Moved through those days believing that staying close didn't mean stepping forward. He believed proximity could remain private, that standing beside someone didn't automatically turn into a statement. For a while, that illusion held. The world had not yet decided it needed a clear story. But pressure never arrives all at once. It tests quietly first. A look held half a second longer than usual. A question asked with just enough hesitation to signal discomfort. People didn't accuse him. They observed him. Observation carries its own weight. He noticed how conversations shifted when certain names entered the room, how jokes softened, how silences stretched. Loyalty was no longer invisible. It was becoming noticeable, and once something is noticed, it starts asking for definition. He wasn't asked to explain himself directly. That would have been easier. Instead, he was given space to step away. Invitations arrived that didn't include everyone. Opportunities opened that required distance. Nothing was framed as betrayal. It was framed as practicality, as smart positioning. He understood what was being offered. He also understood the cost of refusing it. Staying neutral was no longer an option, even though he hadn't chosen a side. Neutrality disappears the moment others decide it's inconvenient. The pressure grew not through confrontation, but through suggestion, through the quiet logic of self-preservation. People reminded him of his own career, his own legacy, his own future. They spoke as if loyalty were something temporary, something that could be paused without consequence. All he had to do was take a step back. Not forward, just back. That step would have gone unnoticed publicly. It would have solved the discomfort in the room. It would have made things simpler for everyone involved, including him. He felt the weight of that simplicity. He felt how easy it would be to accept it. That was the moment loyalty stopped being abstract. It became physical, a tension in the chest, a delay before answering. He wasn't choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing between ease and consistency, between protecting himself and remaining recognizable to himself. The world had begun rewriting the meaning of his position, and he could sense where the story wanted to go. He still had time to step out of it, to let it continue without him. The fact that he didn't, that he remained where he was even as the air changed around him, marked the end of invisibility. Loyalty had crossed a line, and once crossed, it doesn't allow you to pretend you didn't notice. The moment didn't look dramatic, but it felt definitive, permanent, and quietly irreversible. From that point on, staying would no longer be passive. Every day would add weight to the same decision. Every silence would be interpreted. Every presence would be counted. He hadn't raised his voice or made a declaration, but the absence of retreat had begun to speak for him. And once the world starts listening for meaning, even stillness becomes an answer that follows you, whether you wanted to speak or not, whether you were prepared for it or not. If you've ever felt pressure not to act, but to quietly step away, stay with this story. By the time the labels settled in, they no longer sounded foreign. He heard them often enough to recognize their rhythm. Not shouted, not aggressively repeated, but spoken with the quiet confidence of something already agreed upon. Entity, athlete, Joe Frazier, professional boxer. Understood then that being cast as the villain didn't require his participation. It required his silence to be interpreted. People spoke about him as if they knew his intentions better than he did, as if loyalty, once inconvenient, could only exist as defiance. The system around the story began adjusting accordingly. Invitations disappeared, conversations shortened, praise became conditional, always paired with implication. He wasn't attacked directly. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, he was framed. Framing removes the need for debate. It turns complexity into assumption. He felt how quickly the narrative tightened around him, how little space remained to exist without explanation. Every appearance was read as confirmation, every absence as strategy. There was no neutral position left to occupy. The story demanded alignment, and his refusal to realign was treated as aggression. He realized how exhausting it was to carry a meaning you never chose. To wake up knowing that your consistency would be interpreted as stubbornness, your restraint as hostility. He considered stepping in to correct it, issuing statements, clarifying motives, explaining loyalty in language simple enough for crowds to digest. But he understood something then that stopped him. Explanations don't dismantle stories. They feed them. Every word would become another quote, another fragment rearranged to serve the same outline. Silence no longer protected him, but speech wouldn't save him either. That realization forced a harder decision, not about reputation, but about identity. If he spoke to soften the narrative, he would be speaking for the story, not for himself. He would be adjusting to fit it. Staying silent meant accepting the role publicly while refusing it internally. That choice had a cost. The cost was isolation, being present without being welcomed, being known without being understood. He felt how the world rewards those who cooperate with its versions of events and punishes those who complicate them. Loyalty had made him complicated, and complication is treated as threat. He wasn't being pushed out violently. He was being edged out quietly, slowly, with polite distance and settled assumptions. The villain label didn't scream. It settled. And once it settles, it's heavier than noise. Because noise passes. Settled stories stay. They harden over time, becoming reference points others lean on without question, shaping interactions before he even speaks. Over time, he felt himself anticipating reactions before they happened, adjusting posture, tone, and timing, not to please, but to avoid reinforcing a version already locked in place. That constant awareness drained him more than confrontation ever could. It taught him that being misunderstood publicly is survivable, but being slowly rewritten can hollow you out if you let it. And he understood that this stage was only preparation. The story wasn't finished with him yet. It was positioning him for something louder, something that would demand a response, whether he wanted to give one or not, whether he felt ready or not. The pressure was building toward a moment that would no longer allow stillness. If you've ever felt yourself reduced to a role you never agreed to play, stay with this story. The shift didn't happen in one moment. It happened in tone, in how stories were told when he wasn't in the room, in how his name was placed next to someone else's, always second, always defined by comparison. Entity athlete Joe Frazier, professional boxer, didn't announce his position, but the world began announcing it for him. Loyalty, once framed as decency, was slowly rewritten as opposition, not by him, but by the narrative that needed a shape. People prefer clean lines, heroes on one side, obstacles on the other. Complexity doesn't survive crowds. And Frazier, by staying where he was, had become inconvenient to the story taking form. He noticed it first in the questions. They stopped being curious and became leading. Questions that assumed motive, questions that framed him as resistance rather than presence. He could feel how answers were no longer enough. Each response was filtered, trimmed, repurposed to fit something already decided. Silence didn't protect him anymore. It confirmed suspicions. The story wanted contrast, and contrast requires an opposing figure. He hadn't volunteered, but he was available. Loyalty had placed him there. He began to hear himself described differently, not as an individual, but as a role. The role was simple, too simple. It ignored context, it ignored intention, it ignored everything that didn't help the story move faster. Being cast as the villain doesn't require wrongdoing. It requires proximity at the wrong time. The pressure shifted accordingly. It was no longer about stepping away quietly. It was about justifying why he hadn't. The burden moved from decision to defense. He found himself explaining things he never chose publicly, explaining silence, explaining presence, explaining loyalty as if it were aggression. He realized then that the story didn't need his cooperation. It only needed his consistency. Every time he stayed, it added weight to the version being told. Every time he refused to retreat, it hardened the outline. The more consistent he was, the clearer the role became. That clarity didn't bring relief. It brought confinement. He still had an exit. He could still soften the narrative by giving it what it wanted. Distance, disavowal, a public shift that would resolve tension and restore balance. That option was real. It was available. And it would have worked. That was the most dangerous part. Because easy solutions are the ones that rewrite you fastest. Choosing it would mean aligning himself with a version of events he knew was incomplete. It would mean trading truth for relief. He felt the cost of that choice before making it. The cost wasn't public backlash. It was internal erasure. He understood that once he corrected the narrative, he would lose the right to be honest about why he'd stayed in the first place. The world was ready to forgive him for leaving. It wouldn't forgive him for remaining. And in that realization, the shape of the conflict became clear. He wasn't fighting a person. He wasn't even fighting opinion. He was facing a story that required him to move or be moved. And for the first time, he understood that doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was resistance by default. Staying had turned him into something the story needed, whether he agreed with it or not. From that moment on, the space around him felt narrower, as if the narrative itself was closing in, leaving fewer ways to exist without explanation or retreat, fewer places to stand without being defined by someone else's words. If you've ever realized the story about you had already been written, stay with this story. The moment arrived quietly, disguised as inevitability. Not a single headline or confrontation, but the understanding that the space to avoid choosing had vanished. Entity, athlete, Joe Frazier, professional boxer. Felt it in how decisions were presented to him as formalities, already shaped, already weighted. He was expected to adjust, to smooth the edges, to make himself easier to place. The pressure no longer hinted, it stated, align publicly or accept what comes with refusing. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about obedience to the version of events that needed closure. He understood the bargain immediately. Step away and regain access. Distance yourself and be welcomed back into simpler rooms. Say the right thing once, and the story would soften. He could almost hear the relief it would bring to others. Tension resolved, roles clarified, balance restored. The cost of that relief, however, would be paid privately. It would mean confirming a story he knew was incomplete. It would mean teaching the world that pressure works, that consistency can be negotiated if applied long enough. He stood at that edge longer than he expected, not because he was uncertain, but because he was measuring the weight of permanence. Once said, words don't return. Once adjusted, identity doesn't reset. He knew that choosing ease now would follow him quietly for the rest of his life, not as shame, but as absence. The absence of having stayed true when it mattered. He thought about how little drama the choice would generate either way. No applause for staying, no immediate punishment for leaving, just a long echo, the kind you live inside. He realized then that the real decision wasn't between backlash and acceptance. It was between ownership and convenience, between carrying the consequences openly or carrying regret silently. He didn't announce his choice. He didn't frame it as resistance. He simply remained where he was. He allowed the pressure to stand unanswered. That stillness was louder than any statement he could have made. It told the story he refused to tell out loud. The response was immediate. Access narrowed. Support thinned. The consequences he'd been warned about arrived without ceremony. Doors closed without explanation. Invitations stopped without apology. The silence that followed was deliberate, instructive. It was meant to teach him how much comfort he had given up. But so was what he felt inside it. For the first time since the narrative had tightened, he felt aligned internally. The cost was real. The isolation was real. But it was chosen. And chosen costs hurt differently. They hurt clean. They don't linger as questions. In that moment, he understood that this was the point of no return. The story would move forward without his correction. The labels would remain. The misunderstanding would harden. Others would benefit from the simplicity of it. But he would remain intact. He would know why he stayed. He would know that when the pressure peaked, he didn't trade himself for relief. The world would remember him however it needed to. He would remember himself without revision, without editing, without the quiet doubt of having stepped away when staying demanded more. That knowledge settled in him like a line you don't cross twice. It didn't make things easier. It made them final. And in that finality, he found something steadier than approval. He found ownership, and ownership doesn't ask permission. If you've ever chosen to stay and accept the cost rather than escape it, stay with this story. After the choice, the world reacted the way it always does to unresolved stories. It kept going, louder in some places, quieter in others, but never neutral. Entity, athlete, Joe Frazier, professional boxer. Watch the reaction arrive in fragments, comments that sounded sympathetic but carried distance, praise that felt conditional, silence where there used to be invitation. The story didn't explode. It normalized. That was the real consequence. Being absorbed into a version of events that no longer asked for his input. People spoke as if the matter were settled, as if the tension had resolved itself simply because he had refused to resolve it publicly. He noticed how quickly others adjusted, how discomfort fades when it's no longer debated. The world prefers closure, even if it's false. And once closure is declared, those who complicate it become reminders people would rather avoid. He felt the long-term weight of that avoidance, not dramatic rejection, but practical exclusion. Decisions made without him, rooms he no longer entered, opportunities that passed without explanation. None of it was framed as punishment. That would have acknowledged conflict. Instead, it was framed as progress. Moving on. Progress often leaves people behind quietly. He understood then that the price of his choice wasn't a single loss. It was accumulation, small absences stacking over time until they shaped a different life. A narrower one, but also a clearer one. The noise had thinned enough for him to hear himself again. That was unexpected. Without constant pressure to explain, he felt steadier, less reactive. The world's misunderstanding no longer required daily defense because it had already decided what it wanted. That decision freed him in an odd way. He stopped anticipating reactions. He stopped adjusting posture and tone. He became still again, not from caution, but from certainty. He saw how the story continued to circulate without him, gaining details he never provided. He saw how others benefited from the simplicity of it. And he let it happen. Not out of defeat, but out of refusal to participate in a version of himself he didn't recognize. The cost remained real. Loneliness doesn't disappear because it's chosen, but it becomes honest. It doesn't ask questions it can't answer. Over time, he learned how to live inside that honesty without bitterness. He learned that clarity has its own discipline, that silence, when chosen, stops being absence and becomes boundary. Days passed. Years layered themselves quietly on top of the same decision. And he noticed that the echo softened, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer defined him. The misunderstanding stayed, but it lost its authority. He realized that legacy isn't built only through recognition. It's built through what you refuse to surrender, through the moments you allow to remain unresolved because resolving them would require you to disappear inside someone else's narrative. The world moved on. He stayed, not frozen, but grounded. And that difference mattered more than he had expected. It shaped how he measured success, how he defined respect, and how he recognized himself when the noise finally faded into distance and left him with himself alone. Without witnesses, without applause, with only the knowledge that he had not moved when moving would have been easier, and that knowledge stayed with him longer than anything else. It endured. Always. If you've ever lived with the long echo of a choice you couldn't explain, stay with this story. The story never corrected itself. It simply aged. And as it aged, it began to feel finished to everyone except the one who had lived inside its most fragile moment. Entity, athlete, Joe Frazier, professional boxer. Understood then that endings are rarely announced. They are assumed. The world filed his choice away as context, not conflict, as background, not tension. That quiet filing was the final price. When something is no longer debated, it stops evolving. He saw how his name became fixed in a single posture, frozen in a moment others believed they understood. That fixation removed the need to listen further. People didn't ask what it cost him. They assumed the cost had already been paid. But cost doesn't disappear when attention does. It settles. It lives in smaller spaces, in the relationships that never returned, in the recognition that arrived late or not at all, in the sense that some doors don't close loudly, they simply stop opening. He lived with that knowledge without resentment. Resentment would have meant he was still negotiating. He wasn't. He had accepted that the world's memory would never match his experience. That mismatch was permanent, and permanence, once acknowledged, becomes lighter. It stops resisting. He realized that what endured wasn't the misunderstanding, but the alignment he had protected. That alignment shaped his private life more than any public narrative ever could. It governed how he treated others under pressure, how he recognized manipulation when it appeared, how he trusted stillness over urgency. Those were quiet inheritances, invisible to anyone looking only for headlines. He noticed how often people confuse resolution with truth, how quickly they mistake silence for agreement. He didn't correct that mistake. He allowed it to exist, because correction would have required reopening something he had already closed internally. He saw how people often measure legacy by reaction rather than restraint, by noise rather than endurance. His legacy would never satisfy that instinct. It would never resolve cleanly. And that was precisely why it mattered. Because it resisted simplification. Because it remained unresolved by design. He didn't need vindication to confirm the choice. He needed coherence, and he had it. The world moved past the moment. He carried it forward differently, not as burden, but as reference. A line he had already crossed and didn't need to revisit. That line gave him freedom from repetition. He didn't have to prove who he was again. He had already answered the only question that mattered when it counted. Time eventually stripped the story of urgency. What remained was character, revealed not in action, but in refusal. In what he would not exchange for comfort, in what he refused to trade for approval. That refusal aged well, better than applause, better than recognition, better than being understood on someone else's terms. And in the end, when nothing more was asked of him, when the noise had fully moved on, that refusal stood intact, quiet, unargued, complete. It didn't demand agreement, it didn't seek validation, it simply remained. And that remaining was the final form of the choice he had made long ago. A choice that no longer needed defense, explanation, or revisiting to justify its weight. It existed as fact, not argument, and that was enough. Enough to stand on. Enough to end on. Enough to remain, even when everything else had moved on completely. If you've ever realized that some choices don't need closure to be complete, stay with this story. With time, the story hardened into something that no longer reacted to him at all. It existed independently, repeating itself without friction. Entity, athlete, Joe Frazier, professional boxer. Noticed how people referenced the past with certainty, as if it had always been this way. Memories settled into convenience. Nuance was replaced by shorthand. He became a symbol others could use without asking permission. Some used him as contrast, others as caution. Few remembered the quiet reasons behind the moment that defined everything else. That was the final transformation. Not of him, but of perception. The world doesn't revisit choices once it's comfortable with its version of them. It builds forward, stacking meaning on top of assumptions until the foundation disappears. He watched younger voices inherit the narrative without context, repeating conclusions they never tested. He saw how certainty travels faster than understanding, how repetition slowly replaces inquiry. It no longer angered him. Anger requires expectation. What he felt instead was distance, a clean separation between who he was and how he was discussed. That separation protected something essential. It allowed him to exist without negotiation, without constant correction, without rehearsing his own past for others. He saw how legacy often belongs less to those who live it and more to those who explain it later. And he accepted that his explanation would never be the loudest. That acceptance wasn't surrender. It was restraint. He had learned that correcting every misunderstanding is another way of staying trapped inside it. Some truths only survive when they're not performed. He carried his privately. The cost of that privacy remained real, but it no longer felt like loss. It felt like boundary. He recognized that the choice he made had outlived the moment it was made for. It continued shaping how he moved, how he listened, how he refused to rush clarity for comfort. Others saw stubbornness. He felt continuity. He understood then that the value of the choice wasn't proven by outcomes. It was proven by consistency across time. When applause faded and criticism settled, what remained was alignment. That alignment didn't need witnesses. It needed endurance. He didn't correct the story because he no longer lived inside it. He lived alongside it. And that distinction mattered. It meant the narrative could age, distort, and simplify without erasing him. He had built something quieter than reputation. He had built a way to stand still when the world demanded motion. That stillness carried forward, unnoticed by many but intact. Years passed without resolution, and that lack of resolution became its own answer. He learned that being misunderstood is not the worst outcome. Being reshaped to fit expectations is. He avoided that. He let the world keep its version while he kept his center. In that choice, repeated daily, there was discipline. In that discipline, there was peace that didn't need agreement. He learned to live without closure offered by others. And in that intactness, his choice finally revealed its shape. Not heroic, not tragic, just honest. And honesty, once chosen, keeps choosing you back, long after the noise has moved on and the world has stopped asking, long after the moment itself has faded. That endurance was the real result, the only one that mattered in the end. If you've ever let a story move on without you, stay with this story.